contract, we agree that if we have a dispute, this gentleman will arbitrate it. And we have that in writing in our signed contract. Now we have a dispute. I accuse you of cheating me and ask him to arbitrate. If you refuse to go to him as an arbitrator, or if he rules for me and you ignore the ruling, he can report that to anybody. He's presumably got himself a reputation as an impartial person, and even if he doesn't, we can show the contract you signed agreeing that he was the arbitrator. So now we've got a relatively low-cost way of showing to interested third parties which of us is at fault. And this is the point that particularly interests me in the online context, because online we have very powerful technologies for proving certain things in the form of digital signatures. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the technology of digital signatures. It comes out of something called public key encryption, which I don't think, given the context of this talk, it's worth my trying to explain. But what it ultimately means is that I can write a document in such a way that it is easy to prove to any third person that I wrote it. That a digital signature is a much more secure proof than a physical signature, which can be forged. Because the digital signature can only be created using a piece of information called the private key, which I have and never let anybody else have. And other people, without having the private key, if they have the public key that matches that private key, they can check that my private key was used to create the digital signature, and thus that I created it. All right? If this were a talk on that stuff, I'd go into this in much more detail, but I won't. But you can find it on my webpage. Everything's on my webpage. And so what does that mean? It means that you and I can sign a we're never meeting each other. We make a contract online. We digitally sign the contract, including the specification that he is the arbitrator, and including his public key, which is the information needed to check his digital signature. Now, when you violate the contract, I go to him, he arbitrates and says, yes, indeed, you violated the contract. He writes up that verdict and digitally signs it. And I now have a file which I can show to anybody in the world who can rapidly, assuming that people are actually using these technologies, as increasingly they are, though many aren't, that he can rapidly check that it is true that you agreed that he would arbitrate and that he says you're at fault. So that's a very, very low-cost mechanism for letting interested third parties find out who is at fault. And it therefore makes possible reputational enforcement online, even though people don't have faces and expressions and all the ways we normally try to judge human beings in real space. All right. So my point so far is that we've got two mechanisms, discipline of constant dealing and reputational enforcement, to make people keep their contracts. And then the third one, and the one which really has more to do, I think, with your contract design problem, is designing the contract in such a way that it is never in the interest of either party to break it. So if you imagine, when I'm discussing this in class, I say you're having a house built. Suppose you're in a world where you can't enforce contracts, then the deal is that you say to the guy who's building the house, all right, here's $100,000, build me a house. And you never see him again. All right? Alternatively, you say to him, build me a house on my property to my design, and when it's finished, I'll give you $100,000. And when he finishes the house, you point out that a house on your property to your design isn't worth much to anybody else, and you'd like to renegotiate the price. All right? You'll give him $10,000 maybe, if you're feeling nice. So how do you solve that? You solve that with progress payments. You solve that with a system in which, as he's building the house, you are paying him in such a way that ideally there is never a point when either of you is better off just pulling out of the contract. Right? And so you can think about designing, if you think of a contract as sort of a pattern over time from the initial contract to the final performance, at each point either party could pull out. And so you want to try to schedule things like payments and performance in such a way as nearly as possible that there is never a point at which either party would profit by pulling out. Now you still have problems, of course, if circumstances change a lot, which is one reason why contracts do get breached. But at least you can eliminate opportunistic breach, which is the case where somebody breaches not because anything has changed, but because he sees an opportunity to profit by breaching. Now, obviously, part of the way you do this is by things like progress payments, by posting bonds, by agreeing that I will pay you this much this time, this much at that time. But of course, there's a problem with that approach. And the problem with that approach is that the more I prepay, the less my incentive to breach, but the greater your incentive to breach. And the solution to that problem is to replace a bond with a hostage. What is a hostage? A hostage is something such that you can hurt me without profiting yourself. Right? If I post a bond with you and you just just grab the bond and leave, that hurts me, but it also benefits you, so it reduces my incentive to break the contract, but increases your incentive. On the other hand, if what I give you is something that's very valuable to me and to nobody else, that's a hostage. Now you can take the hostage or destroy the hostage while thus imposing a cost on me if I break the contract, but you have no incentive to do that in order to break it yourself because you get no gain. And I usually, when discussing this, give my favorite example of the failure of this mechanism, which happened in, I think, 12th century England, and involved one of the most famous men of the period, who you've probably never heard of, who's a man called William Marshall, who started life as the fourth son of a minor baron, ended life as regent of England for John's son, and in between was probably the most famous tournament knight in Western Europe. He was a man who probably, in terms of martial combat among knights, regarded Richard the Lionhearted, who was a contemporary, as a talented amateur. When William Marshall was a small child, his father, John, was participating in a civil war, the Stephen and Matilda Civil War. I don't know if any of you have ever covered that, but it was a rather unpleasant conflict about 2 generations after the Norman conquest. William's father was unusually loyal for barons during that civil war. He only switched sides once. And having done so, he faithfully fought for Matilda, one of the 2 claimants, whose son, Henry II, eventually inherits, for the rest of the war. And at one point, Stephen, who is the other claimant, shows up in front of the castle with a big army and says, "Surrender your castle to me." And Marshall says, "I got a deal for you. Taking this castle is going to take you a good deal of time and effort. So here's what I'll do. I'm going to send to Matilda to ask her to send a relieving army to save my castle. I agree that if she doesn't, in 3 days I'll surrender the castle." And Stephen says, "Well, that sounds very nice, but why do I know you'll keep this agreement?" He says, "Tell you what, I'll give you the kid. I'll give you my son William as a hostage, and you can kill him if I don't surrender the castle." So Stephen agrees, takes the kid hostage, and goes off because he's got other things to do with his army. And William's father spends 3 days supplying the castle, hiring troops, because he, like Stephen, knows perfectly well that Matilda has no army that she's going to send to his relief close enough to be any good. Stephen comes back and says, 3 days surrender, and I think it's John Marshall, or whatever William's father's name is, says, "Ha ha, fooled you. We're ready for a siege now." And Stephen says, "I'll kill the kid." And his father says, "I have 3 more sons, and have I not still the hammer and the anvil with which to forge more?" And Stephen, who was too tender-hearted for his own good, at least for somebody fighting a civil war in England in the early 12th century, ends up keeping on threatening, but he's going to throw the kid in a piece of from a siege engine into the castle, and the kid says, "Great playground equipment, can I play on it?" And eventually he gives in and does not kill the boy, which results in quite a lot of changes in history from what would have happened otherwise, given William's later career. I should say that when William Marshall becomes regent of England, there is a French army sitting in London, commanded by the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne, as a late stage of John's war with the barons. And by the time William stops being regent, the French are all back in France, everything is at peace, and everything is fine. But that's another story. But if you want to read a neat bit of history that you probably never got, the life of William Marshall is worth reading. Anyway, but that's an example of the problem with hostages, of course. You've got to be reasonably sure that you know how valuable the hostage is to the person who is taking it. Suppose this doesn't work. Suppose that you are signing a contract where at some point during the performance it will be in the interest of one of the parties to breach